We're back at it, Darlene.
Here we are.
Here we are. And we're moving into the next. So we've already talked about the first decade at Seeds. And now we're moving into the second decade, beginning in 2010 to 2015. And we have to be honest that...
It's one big fuzzball.
Dates are very fuzzy, and remembering where things happened and what was happening. In fact, ironically, the closer we get to the present day, the more fuzzy it feels. I feel like I had much more clarity about stuff that happened 20 years ago than I do 10 years ago.
Well, first of all, we have to just say it's less about, we don't have to get timelines right. We don't have to get all the facts right. It's just a way of us talking about somewhere during this period of time, what things were significant. So I think that one of the things that came up was that from 2010 to 2015, our early adolescence as a church, our rebel years, is the time where we explored soul care, about what it really meant to be a real community willing to have real conversations. And I think one of the realizations was how much, how non-intuitive actually it is to have conversations that matter with people, that it's very easy to kind of slip into a lot of patterns. And so it started with leadership first, kind of went deep into some training on soul care, spiritual formation, spiritual direction, different kinds of language for it, but ways in which we could grow as a community to both be a safe place where people could talk, share, be where they are, and where we could also be that too, like where that could be a mutual, reciprocal relationship with people. So in cell groups that meant that a group of leaders first took some training with Larry Crabb and then slowly spread out that learning to other people in the Seeds community, and ideally with the vision that every cell group would be able to practice good ways of being in relationship with each other and having conversations that were real, and kind of got out of some of the pitfalls that we tend to have when we enter into a conversation.
Yeah, I think it's good to talk about the pitfalls, because I think for many people, there aren't a lot of great experiences of having conversations with other people that, I don't know how to say this exactly, but it kind of like, there's certain patterns that we get caught up in, and party with a number of people and you start having conversations. I mean, like one of the patterns that can happen is people they really want to tell you about themselves, and they want to somehow perform for you about how great things are going, or how accomplished they've become, or, there's all these, we probably all have experience with having conversations with people like that. And maybe we've have experience of speaking like that when we're trying to impress people, or we're trying to,
so like different settings, right?
Yeah.
Of like what you were talking about, a party is a more casual setting. And then there's a setting where someone's actually telling you something that's really difficult that's happened in their life. And then the pitfalls of all the things people say that are just the worst.
Yeah, exactly. Times when people are really dealing with a very, very difficult situation, and they get up the nerve to make themselves vulnerable to people and share their situation. And it's quite common for people, out of the goodness of their heart, trying to be helpful, maybe dealing with the awkwardness of having to deal with a very real, difficult situation, they'll talk about themselves and their experience with hard times.
Right.
Or they might have a lot of great advice. Well, have you tried this? Have you tried this herbal supplement?
There are lots of things we can talk about in this realm. What sticks out as, like, there's some language that we learned during this season, our School of Spiritual Direction stuff gave us new language that we could use for how to have good conversations. What's the thing that sticks out the most to you, in terms of what a tag or a phrase or?
Well, I think one of the most helpful things that I ever learned was the idea of doing a red dot exercise. To this day, if you are gathering a group of people and you're trying to collect people together and just get people on board with each other and become present to each other, the power of asking people what their red dot is, which is basically just a question, how are you really doing? Where do you locate yourself?
But somehow it is very different than saying, how are you? Because
why? Why do you think it's different?
I mean, how are you is just such a wide open question for whom most people don't actually want that answer. And the red dot, the way that we would talk about it is, either at a trailhead or in a mall or whatever. It's locating, taking a moment to locate, where you're coming into this meeting right now. We would do this at the beginning of our meetings. Let's say, where are you at? What are you coming into this meeting with?
Yeah.
And you go around the circle and it's just instead of saying, how are you? Well, I'm pretty good, or
not too good.
But somehow when you say where do you find yourself coming into this meeting tonight, then it somehow has had a way of evoking some very meaningful ways to begin a conversation. Even if you have an agenda, you've got this is a team meeting and there's things that we need to discuss, but let's start just with giving some space to locating where we are.
I think maybe the magic of it is that it kind of is a bit of a sideways way of asking about how you're doing, and it evokes more creative answers. So, of course, you need to create an environment where you're able to say exactly what your location is, and so you might say, well, I'm where are you right now? I'm really nervous, or I'm very excited, or I'm just so tired. I'm just exhausted. I have no energy for anything. Maybe I don't have energy for this meeting that I'm about to participate in.
And we don't talk about this maybe a lot to the whole congregation or publicly or whatever, but if sometimes our meetings were largely taken by just creating space for that.
Yeah.
It's kind of for the first hour just ended up being people connecting about what's going on in their life.
And I mean, I think one of the ground rules about doing red dots is that people just get to share as much or as little as they have to share about where they are. Nobody is being asked to react or respond to what's said. There's no sort of that's not a good place to be. There's not a judgment sort of approach to it. We should be in some particular place. There's just a recognition that we are somewhere, and we want to be where we are and be vulnerable enough to share where we are at. And I still think that shouldn't be considered magic, but it seems like having a posture in small group or in larger groups of recognizing that people come together in very different places is a bit of a freeing sort of perspective.
Well, I think the magic really is that the goal, for lack of a better word, of intentional soul care or attention to someone's journey is that if I'm joining you, if I that kind of language of oh, someone is sharing and we're joining. We're not fixing, we're not determining, we're not judging. We're just joining somebody. And it is being joined and joining somebody else is powerful. That's powerful stuff.
As we've been talking about this, I think it just feels natural to talk about kind of skills or postures that sort of flow out of a red dot exercise that help us to get more, I guess, in depth into where people are at and thinking about how the growth process can help happen for people. Right from the very beginning at Seeds, we knew that some kind of small groups, environments, like cell groups or whatever, like were going to be really important to being a church, because you cannot have intimacy, you cannot have good connection if groups are too large. So this seemed like in this start of this decade, we started to understand what would it look like to kind of create environments that were small group oriented, but also would allow us to create safe, growth-oriented spaces. We want to talk about some of the skills that we emphasize to help kind of create those kinds of communities where we use the language of where we could have conversations that mattered, not conversations where we took in a lot of information about what we should know or believe or do, but we're more engaged in the actual living of the people that were part of the group. What were some of the things that we learned?
Well, I'm just, again, thinking about people that are maybe listening, and I'm sure because most people are probably that are listening are from the Seeds community, are thinking about some of their experience, because we've had some very powerful experiences over the years of being in a small group, either intentionally working on soul care or just like whether it's a team meeting or a cell group or a one-on-one with somebody, profound kind of experiences that would emerge when somebody actually feels like listened to or like they can share something, and they know that, for example, so one of the things that we practiced a lot was around curiosity and not pivoting. This is like a huge don't pivot, which means, the tendency to, when somebody shares something that's true for them, and then we say, oh yeah, me too, and then we kind of go off and then, make it all about us.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, one of the, if there's one thing in this stage of practicing of soul care, that don't pivot became like a really good thing, but also a bit of an obstacle.
Yeah, no one ever got any good advice for a while because everybody was afraid to say.
Or they say, I know I'm not supposed to pivot,
but I'll do it anyway.
And then sometimes people are like, please, you can say something. You guys don't all need to sit around and be quiet and not interact with me.
I think one of the really powerful things about being curious in relationship with another person or in the context of a group is that people get a really good opportunity to actually be listened to. And so obviously good listening is actually hearing what people are saying and be able to let people say what they need to say. But often when you add curiosity to the mix, then people start asking good questions like what? So what do you think is beneath, what you just said about your red dot? Tell us more about what's the exhaustion about? And then person has to kind of go a little bit deeper into the story and say, well, probably has a lot to do with, this thing that I'm struggling with, or this anxiety I have, this relationship that is giving me a lot of stress. And you kind of, in the process of asking curious questions, you start to dig deeper, and often good questions create insight for people. Even if you don't give people insight, they start to see things in their own story as they talk about them. And if nothing else, they feel very heard and listened to. And a lot of people have the experience of never really having people care enough about them to actually get into stuff with them.
Yeah, to invest and to really like give themselves to a person's story for a period of time.
Yeah.
And I think that was also sometimes terrifying for people if they knew it was going to be their turn to talk about their life. It would be both terrifying to have all the attention on you, perhaps, but also I don't think that there's a single person at the end of an evening like that didn't feel a sense of like warmth and opening, like as a result of it. And sometimes it was clunky and messy too, because sometimes the group, if I'm remembering correctly, like the cell group would be like, you had like, I don't know what questions to ask. You know, if you're a person that you're listening to somebody's story and a little bit of pressure, like I have to come up with some good questions. You know? So
Like to pick up on the pressure thing, I think that was one of the big learnings too, was for people who are in relationship with each other and specifically leaders who are facilitating groups and conversations. One of the big learning was learning how to kind of remove the pressure that maybe sometimes is there, that, you know, I need to say something wise or helpful, or boy, they've shared a really, really hard situation and I feel stuck and don't know what to offer, feel like very out of control. And it felt like we learned through soul care that part of being a part of communities where conversations mattered was that you would let go of the need to sort of control or make something happen and kind of trust the spirit and trust God to be moving somehow in the midst of things and kind of take the pressure off. I think it's always a real trap for leaders, is to feel like you're somehow an expert. You become an expert to people, and you should always have something worthwhile to say. And quite frankly, people's situations are complex enough and hard enough that often you can't help them in any tangible way, but you can join them and you can understand where they're coming from in a deeper way and help people feel heard and supported. And sometimes stuff emerges in that process that ends up being actually significant help to people, or at the very least, they feel like they have people on their side and they're with them. So yeah, it was this was a real challenging, but also really meaningful, I think, phase of the Seed's life, where we were getting more into understanding what makes for good conversation, meaningful conversation.
I think it was probably during this time also where tools for understanding one another. So soul care is one, and the Enneagram is another tool that we started to access. And sometimes small groups or cell groups. Why am I starting to call them small groups?
I don't know.
Cell groups did some learning around Enneagram. And
do you want to say a little bit about what the Enneagram is? Like,
yeah,
people
I will.
might not know,
But before I do that,
okay.
I maybe just want to say that what drove these environments is that I think as a church community, we wanted to take seriously growth as a human being, or connection with God as a human being, that involves an understanding of ourselves and others and the world and God. But so these tools of soul care and Enneagram, which I'll explain in a minute, are ways that helped us in relationship with each other, but also helped us in relationship with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that is in line with our DNA, like with wanting to be a community that has environments where people can grow in their relationship to themselves, to others, and to God, and see that all as spiritual work. It's not like, oh, just the God piece is the church's job, but these other environments are also really crucial. And so you're good at actually explaining the Enneagram in a summary kind of way.
I think most people are familiar with personality typing systems. The Myers-Briggs type indicator system was probably quite known to a lot of people. And Enneagram is one that has become quite popular in the culture over the last few decades.
It's an ancient tool, though.
It's definitely
Sufis.
Well, yeah, Sufis and Franciscan spiritual direction.
So we're talking like
Richard Rohr talked about this kind of stuff was taught to them as Franciscan priests, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. And then he said that suddenly the whole culture was talking about these things as the Enneagram became very popular starting in the 80s. And so he started just talking about it. It's like, everybody else is talking about it. I can talk about what we were being taught. In the Enneagram, there's 9 basic types of personalities. And the idea is that everybody is predominantly one type. And there's interrelationships between the types. It's a wheel of 9 spots. And then there's also lines that connect the numbers across the wheel. I mean, if you don't know about it, you could simply just Google Enneagram and you would get all kinds of information to get into it. I think the thing that we started to, we were introduced to Enneagram
in the
so
90s.
Long ago, in the early 90s, and when we were doing pastoral education, and our professor introduced us to it, and we had a lot of fun with it and with our friends and stuff, and sort of parked it in our own thinking. And in this time between 2010 and 2020, it started to get a little more traction in the culture, and people were talking about it, and we saw it as a great tool for people to understand more about themselves, and then also understand more about the people they're in relationship with. And when it came down to it, the types that we find ourselves to be, these are types that are sort of images of God, of the divine. And so we all have a piece of ourselves that is sort of representing the divine. So that also connects us to understanding who we've been created to be. And like we started talking about at the beginning of this, people like to talk about themselves. That's pretty common. People love to learn more about how they're wired and how they're motivated.
Some people do, not everybody.
I'd say most people like to know about who they are.
I don't know. There's definitely some people that are like, I don't want to do the Enneagram. I'm not interested in the Enneagram.
Yeah, they're probably a certain type. They're probably just happen to be a certain type.
Well, just like anything that we've done, whether it's soul care or centering prayer or, different forms of exploration, some people really grab onto it and it's their jam, and other people are like, I am not interested in centering prayer. Being quiet for 20 minutes sounds like the worst thing in the world to me, and some people are like that with.
I'm more of a honey person than a jam person, but anyway.
It's your honey?
It's not my jam.
Anyway, this, I think, again, when thinking about a faith community and how a community works and struggles to work together, these tools can help us to be a bit more understanding of ourselves and other people. Be like, well, why does this person operate so differently than me? And you'd learn a little bit more about, that's because these are the things that matter to this person. These are the motivations. These are the fears, you know?
Yeah, core fears and core desires.
I think all those things they've been incredible gifts to any community that wants to learn how to be together. Because frankly, being in community it's a big freaking mess a lot of times, right? Yeah. You got all these people.
A lot of times, most of the time with, our stories and our wounds and our dreams, and you throw them all together, and
just hope for the best.
Yeah. I mean, like in some ways, like Enneagram has been like, I think it's a great model of typology for the church, like for Christian theology, because we believe strongly that everybody's made in the image of God. Everybody has inherent worth as children of God. That is a core theological belief that we have. And the Enneagram kind of puts that in a finer point and says, yeah, not only that, we've all been created uniquely, and we are children of God in unique ways. And sometimes we tend to think that everybody should be the way that we are wired. I think building on that foundation, what it starts to create in people is compassion for people that are different than...
and hopefully compassion for ourselves too,
Yeah.
because that's sometimes just as difficult.
Yeah. I always remember in one of the videos around Enneagram that somebody was saying that as they got to learn about another person, they said, oh, I thought they were a jerk. And now I realize they're just this number of the Enneagram. And then it makes all the difference, you know? And so these are the kind of things that we tend to label people in certain ways, and having a way of helping us to understand ourselves better and understand others better really creates a community that values difference and diversity and figures out how, oh, that's your superpower. Well, this is my superpower, and that person's superpower. How can we kind of harness it all to work together? And then also at the same time realize, well, yeah, that's your shadow, and that's your weakness because you're wired that way. And how do we help support you in growth and, being a more fully realized human being?
How do you think, or do you think that work, Enneagram work that you've done yourself, has made a big difference in the kind of leader you are? Yeah,
I mean, I learned, I think, pretty early on in my leadership that my leadership skills and gifts were maybe a little bit different than the typical pastoral leader was. And so just realizing that I might be different than other people in how I am a pastor was a bit freeing, because it allowed me to ask, okay, like what type of pastor am I going to be with the gifts and personality kind of motivations that I have? And then you start to realize that, well, you don't have all the understanding of the way life works. You need a team of people. And so often in our leadership, we've spent time doing work on, doing strength finders and doing personality things so that we understand how we interact with each other, and maybe why sometimes there's friction, and how we can handle conflict and be better teams. So I feel like it was huge in leading teams to have understandings of where people are coming from. And then I know too, a big thing is we've done a lot of pre-marriage counseling over the years. And I know in later years, we just became so much more comfortable understanding where people were coming from, even without them knowing the language of the Enneagram. But we kind of would be able to pick up on the things that were going on, and it would help us ask questions. And sometimes people would say things like, well, how did you know that about me? Well, we've been given a bit of a map of how different people understand the world. And, you can bring more insightful curiosity to people.
Yeah.
And it's fun sometimes too, just to joke about it.
You want to talk about from this decade or
no
5 years?
I think we're done.
Yeah, I think so too. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.